Hi, this is Nedra Cherif. I'm a research collaborator at the European University Institute with the Middle East Direction Program. I'm here to provide a few insights about Libya's constitutional process. With the resumption of the Libyan political dialogue under the auspices of the United Nations, a preliminary agreement has been reached to hold general elections in December 2021. But for these elections to take place, a constitutional basis is needed that would define the mandates and prerogatives of the new authorities to be elected. However, such a constitutional framework is currently missing in Libya, and there is persistent disagreement among Libyan stakeholders on this point, which is why it has lately regained so much attention. An agreement needs to be reached urgently on this issue if the elections are to take place by the agreed deadline. In the aftermath of the Libyan uprising and the fall of the Gaddafi regime, the transitional authorities envisioned the elaboration of a new constitution for Libya, a constitution that could meet the aspirations of the Libyan people. For this purpose, a Constitution Drafting Assembly, the CDA, was elected in February 2014 to produce a draft that would later be submitted to a popular referendum. The process was initially set to last only for a few months, but it eventually expanded over several years. And only in July 2017 did the CDA adopt its final draft, but it has so far failed to be submitted to a popular referendum. And since then, the whole constitution-making process has remained frozen. Well, no constitution-making process is an easy exercise, but Libya faced exceptionally difficult circumstances. At the time of the drafting process, the country was getting divided into competing ruling authorities and slipping into civil war. Moreover, the CDA had to face its own weaknesses, the lack of political and constitutional experience of its members, and their diverging views on what the constitution should include, which triggered significant debates and provoked several blockages and boycotts by its members. And this comes in addition to external pressure being exercised on the drafters by different political or armed groups to control or to hamper the constitution-making process. Well, obviously, no constitution can gather unanimous support, and even less the Libyan one, in view of the difficult conditions in which it was produced. The CDA's draft was thus a compromise document that sought to reconcile the drafters' diverging views and to embody the largest possible consensus. As such, it could not be all-satisfying, and there are still several groups today who contest some of its provisions, for instance, provisions related to the symbols of the Libyan states or the form of local governance. Other groups contest the drafts because they criticize the drafters' decision to defer some of the most controversial or sensitive issues to the next parliament. And eventually, additional groups do reject the draft, but more for political reasons. They would prefer to retain the current political status quo or to resort to other constitutional documents, such as, for instance, the country's independence constitution of 1951. The answer is clearly no. A constitutional framework is needed for the elections to take place. The question that remains to be answered is which document to use, and Libyans still disagree on this point today. Since the CDA's draft is partly contested, several alternatives have been envisioned and discussed, including relying on the Independence Constitution of 1951, but in an amended form, or revising the Interim Constitutional Declaration, the document that has served as Libya's provisional constitution since 2011. A last option would be to rely on the CDA's draft, but only for a temporary period. Although going to elections has become a priority for many Libyans and international actors, holding a referendum on the Syria's draft still remains a popular demand. And indeed, if the draft is adopted by popular referendum, it would provide Libya with a stable and permanent constitutional basis on which to elect the new authorities. The drawback is that organizing the referendum could delay the elections beyond December 2021. And in particular, if the draft is rejected the first time by the people and needs further revisions. On the other side, advocates of holding the elections first consider that the renewal of the political class is more important, and that adopting a permanent constitution for Libya could be postponed until after the elections. But this implies holding the elections on a provisional constitutional basis and opening a new transitional period for Libya, while the Libyan people has been longing for a return to stability. There are still many challenges on the path to elections while time is running short. First, Libyans are still far from an agreement on the constitutional basis on which to hold these elections. Additionally, an electoral law also needs to be adopted by the parliament before July for the elections to realistically take place at the end of the year. There is also persistent disagreement on whether the new president should be elected directly by the people or indirectly by the parliament. And as a consequence, it remains unclear whether the forthcoming elections would be legislative ones or both legislative and presidential ones. And on the security front, the situation in Libya remains fragile, and there are concerns that holding the elections in unstable conditions could affect the integrity of the polls, but also trigger renewed tensions. The problem is that not holding the elections could prove dangerous as well, as it may drive the country into an institutional crisis and also reactivate military conflict.